everybody. Hi, Carrie. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I am wonderful, and I'm excited to talk to you today because I know this is one of the topics that is so near and dear to your heart. So
It
let's just
is.
get right into it. We're going to talk today about unit design, and I feel like Carrie is just like my go-to person whenever I need some help in this area. So
I'm such a nerd about unit design.
I
It's
know,
funny
and I
because
love
that's how
it.
I met you. Do you remember
I
that?
know.
That's how I met you.
Yes, because you had actually designed a unit that you were wanting to share, and it ended up becoming your book, La Hija del Sastre, which is so
It did.
cool. So what we want to do today is we want to kind of just walk through some of the big topics when it comes to unit design, and some of these really could almost be a separate episode. So we're going to kind of give you an overview today, and we can hopefully revisit some of these things in another episode. We're going to talk about why you would want to design a unit, first of all. We're going to talk about how to find elements to incorporate into the unit that you're designing to kind of anchor the unit. We're going to talk just about what is the process of backward design and get into just a tiny, tiny bit on assessment. So, Carrie, why would someone want to take the step of designing their own unit?
I think that in a lot of cases we've been, kind of stuck between the covers of textbooks. And
Hmm.
so if it wasn't inside the textbook that we're teaching, we just didn't teach about it. And yet, people travel different places or people
Hmm.
have a favorite band that they love. And we have all these
Hmm.
passions as language teachers and we ignore them in favor
Hmm.
of whatever this book says we should be teaching. And
Hmm.
so to design a unit, just to find a spot in your schedule where you can design a unit that is about something that you're going to be really passionate about, your
Hmm.
students will feel that passion of yours coming through in the unit, and it will make it one of the most exciting things they
Hmm.
study when they
Yeah.
see that you
And
love.
I know, Carrie, I know you're really passionate about sustainability and the sustainable development goals. And I know that you've developed a ton of those units for your students because that's what you're passionate about. So you're bringing your passion into the classroom and using it as a vehicle for your students to acquire Spanish.
Yes. And I do all of those units through backward design. It's one of
Hmm.
the keys for me is to think about why I want them to be studying this in the first place. And that was something I haven't always done. I just
Hmm.
sort of unquestioningly taught what was prescribed to me
Hmm.
rather than asking, why do I need my students to tell me what chores they do around the house? They tell me they don't do any. Is this really
Right.
valuable information?
It's a sad state of affairs in
I
many
know.
households.
When there's eye rolling instead of chore doing.
Right. You don't need to even speak another language to roll your eyes at your mom. So,
Yeah. Empty the dishwasher wasn't even like on the list of things. Like nobody
no.
sets the table and cleans the table anymore. It's empty
Right.
and refill the dishwasher.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think first of all, just giving ourselves permission to deviate a little bit from the prescribed curriculum, if you have one. Or maybe you're in the opposite situation where it's wide open. Maybe you don't even have a curriculum at all, and you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. So I feel like knowing how to design a unit can kind of fill the needs of both of those types of teachers. And also, I just really love the idea of something that you've experienced yourself or something that you're just passionate about, something that you can kind of be an expert on for your classes, and being able to bring that into your teaching situation. It just makes everything more fun.
100%. And to do good unit design, the one thing that we have to all think about ahead of time, and if you've ever talked to me before, you know about my chuck it bucket. The chuck it bucket is your mental trash can, your physical
Hmm.
trash can, where you're going to put all the stuff that you clean out to make room for this new unit that you're going to do.
Hmm.
So I would encourage you to even go through vocab lists and chuck some of the stuff that you think, man, set
Hmm.
and clear the table just isn't a thing anymore. How can I replace
Right.
that with something that if I'm going to teach this unit? So we're going to talk
Yeah.
a few times in here about the chuck it bucket, but that's what it is. Just the place that we're going to put maybe even whole units that we think, I don't need to teach this for my students to be successful. And this is a great place to pow in a powerful unit.
Right. Or maybe you have a unit that has like a couple of valuable things in it, but the rest of it is just kind of like, I'm not excited about this. Is there a way that you can kind of hone in on one aspect of that unit and go a little bit deeper? Or is there just a whole other topic that could still address some of the goals of that unit and not completely throw the baby out with the bathwater, but just make it into something maybe a little bit newer, more updated, something a little bit more fun and entertaining?
Or like the lens that you're looking at a unit. If you're talking about the house and you're just memorizing rooms of the house and furniture, that's not nearly as engaging to students as finding out, what does housing look like around the world? Like, do people live in small apartments in the city? Do they, having that experience of just looking at the lens culturally, this is what housing looks like around.
Yeah, totally. So, where do you start? So let's say you've got a really great idea and, there's something that it's on your radar, something you want to teach your students about. Like, what do you do first? What do you look for?
Well, so I always feel like the inspiration hits when some random video or something passes. But so I was on Twitter and somebody shared this video and it said, "Stop sucking." And it was a video about like just this funny video about not using straws because straws contribute to the microplastic issue. And, there's something so easy to get rid of it and just drink out of the cup. So it's not like, your one straw is going to ruin the universe. But if everybody kind of stopped using straws. So that ended up becoming a unit on ocean plastics in my classroom. So I think that, even something small, if you see a video or if you see even a meme or a comic that you think, wow, I'd like to share this with my students, it may be the centerpiece of a unit.
Or it might just be that little tiny seed that gets something growing in your mind. I know I am like you. I tend to develop units based on that one little thing, whether it's a reader or a song or a YouTube video or just something that somebody says to me that just gets me thinking. I don't
an
usually
infographic,
I don't usually have like a title of a unit in my mind and then set out to make that unit. It's usually started by some little thing that I just kind of happen to come across.
That turns into an avalanche.
Yes.
A snowball to an avalanche.
And I'm always just a curious person too. Like if there's something that I don't know, something I've never heard about, I do tend to Google. So, sometimes if something seems interesting to me, I just start maybe Googling, what is this all about? And then that leads me down this rabbit hole. YouTube is kind of the best place to really, really get deep into a rabbit hole on different topics.
Yes.
Wikipedia is another one that
Pinterest.
really sucks you in. Yeah. And so sometimes like as I'm digging into the topic a little bit more, I might even find some other little facet of the topic that's even more interesting to me. And then that just leads me into another direction. So, that part of it has never really been a problem for me. Like finding the resource is not my problem. It's like finding a way to organize all the resources that I find that tends to be my biggest problem.
And even just keeping that chuck it bucket handy because it's easy to drown your students in too much information as well, because we can really quickly go back to this flood of vocabulary and grammar points and stuff that is too much for them. So chuck in what you don't
To me,
need.
that's why the whole concept of understanding by design, backward planning makes the most sense, because if you're just like throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what's going to stick, that's not the best, just gathering a whole bunch of links to random stuff. That's not a unit. There has to be some purpose in your planning. So how do you go from like, oh, I found this resource that looks really cool and I'd like to use it. Like, what do you do then? How do you actually get it to become a unit?
Well, the first thing, understanding by design has three parts. And so the
Mm-hmm.
first thing that you have to do is decide, what do you want your students to know at the
Mm-hmm.
end of this unit? Like, how are they going to demonstrate their knowledge to you?
Mm-hmm.
So, and to have that be leveled correctly for your
Mm-hmm.
students. So, I mean, that's a big deal, thinking about
Right.
how you're going to do that. Once you know what your goal is, your overarching goal for this unit, then you can design the assessment, which is totally
Mm-hmm.
backward from the way I did it before, which is why it's called backward design. You
Mm-hmm.
start with the assessment.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'm going to use to assess my students. And then you build all of the lesson content. But the reason that makes it such a powerful unit is because you already knew what you were going to do to assess them. So you can
Mm-hmm.
then look at each chunk that you build into the unit to
Mm-hmm.
decide whether or not it leads them to success on that final assessment that you
Right.
planned on ahead.
So what we call beginning with the end in mind, right? Thinking
Yes,
about where are we going to
exactly.
end up. So, and since we're language teachers, we have to think not only about what do we want our students to know, but we also have to think about what do we want them to be able to do
Yes.
linguistically with that knowledge. So we might have different goals for what kind of knowledge do we want them to acquire versus what do we want them to be able to say about the knowledge, because they may acquire more knowledge than they're actually able to communicate
Yes.
in the
That
target
receptive
language.
language is
Hmm.
so much broader than their
Right.
productive language. And
Right.
so just knowing that and giving them grace on what they say
Hmm.
back, they're not going to be able to say it the same way that we do,
Hmm.
but can they communicate clearly what their thoughts and feelings are about the
Right.
topic?
And to me, vocabulary is always really important whenever I'm teaching kind of a more content-based unit.
Yes.
I, I obviously I want to see their whole language develop over time, but I'm not as focused on, when it comes to something that's knowledge-based, I'm not as focused on how well they're saying it as much as, just like you said, are they getting their point across? Like, could a
Yes.
sympathetic native speaker comprehend what they're saying and engage in a conversation with them? So to me, that's
And
the
that's intermediate language, like all the
yeah.
way to intermediate mid. It has to
Mhm.
be someone that is accustomed to language learners. Only when
Mhm.
they hit that intermediate, mid, and high are they understandable to people who
Mhm.
aren't accustomed to language
Right.
learners. So that means they're messy for
Right.
a long time.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we be super aware of what a student at a given level should be able to do in terms of language production and in terms of language comprehension. To me, that is a huge problem in our field, is I
Yes.
think that teachers don't always know what a realistic expectation is for students. And I think sometimes we look at, like, what can our highest achieving students do, and we call
Yes.
that an A. And those high achieving students might just be like an anomaly. That doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean
They're
that
the
that's
A
what all
plus.
of them, right? So I think just being aware of what those proficiency descriptors actually are, and not expecting students, just because they're in level 4 or 5, that doesn't mean they're an advanced speaker. That doesn't mean they're going to be
No.
just communicating in full paragraphs, comprehensible to
About
everybody
any
around them
topic. Yeah.
on any topic. Yeah. So just educating yourself on what the actual proficiency levels look like, to me, is a hugely important part of this whole process.
I agree.
Okay. So, back to my original question. So where do we start? We start by creating our assessment, right? And
So let's say that your assessment is going to be, at the end of this unit, I want my students to be able to give a 2-minute elevator
mhm,
pitch
mhm,
about why it's important not to use as many single-use plastics.
mhm,
That's a hard, like, 2 minutes of talking
right.
and about single-use plastics, and really convincing someone of their
Mhm,
reason. So I have to make sure through this unit that I'm giving them the opportunity to see people giving and defending an
Mm-hmm.
opinion about it. And they're having,
Mm-hmm.
immersed in all of these words about microplastics so that I can make sure they can do it. It was something that was crazy. I used the unnamed textbook when years ago. And at the end, it would have grammar,
Mm-hmm.
vocabulary, some reading little section, and then it would say, and write a letter to your Aunt Nan about coming to your house for Christmas. Well, the whole unit, we never wrote anything. And now
Right.
all of a sudden they're saying, now write a letter to Aunt Nan. Well, they don't know how. All they know how to do is
Yeah.
conjugate verbs and memorize vocabulary. So they've
Mm-hmm.
not, so we need to make sure our units are stepping them up to be able to do those productive things on their assessment.
Right. And if we don't know where we're going, we can't plan for how to get there. So that's why we make our assessment the first thing that we do. So,
And that really comes from National Board as well. National Board talks about, knowing what your end is in mind and knowing that
mm-hmm.
students are ready at each step to keep
Mm-hmm.
advancing toward that end and not just shove them all towards it and say, oh, well, some of you didn't master this content. We're moving on
Mm-hmm.
anyway. How do you bring as many as possible toward mastery? I mean, obviously you're not going to get everybody because some of them worked till 2 a.m. and slept through your class. So
Right.
you can't, you can't hold that against yourself, but just in what ways can you try to make sure they're prepared?
Mm-hmm. So, Carrie, I know you are a goddess of unit planning. Everyone knows. Everyone knows. So, what are some just general tips that you would give to teachers who maybe have never planned a unit outside of their textbook or outside of something they purchased on Teachers Pay Teachers? Like, what advice would you give someone who's just getting started out?
I would say that there are three main things. Don't think of an assessment as just a vocabulary and grammar quiz. Like really think on your assessment, how would students use this in the real world? Like what's
Mm-hmm.
something that they might do in their life beyond your classroom that they would need this material for? Because a realistic assessment like that is much more engaging for you to listen
Mm-hmm.
to and for them to create. And I would say take a deep dive into the topic that you're passionate about. Most of us have some burning topic that we really love.
Mm-hmm.
I just love Pablo Neruda. I can't. So
Mm-hmm.
how are you going to make Pablo Neruda accessible to your students and make them
Yeah.
excited about him too? What kinds of little hooks can you do? And I
Mm-hmm.
guess that would be the third thing. Like think of a way that your unit can hook your students in. That's one of the things that I do through Understanding by Design. It came from them. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen it with Dave Burgess and Teach Like a Pirate.
Mm-hmm.
How do you hook their interest? Because we as teachers have so many experiences tied to our language that it's part of us now. And they don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
They're just these little blank slates that they don't have any connection to the language yet. So how are we
Right.
going to hook them in so that they feel excited about learning what we're learning too? How about you? What
Yeah.
would your tips to planning be?
What would my advice be? So,
Yeah.
I always like to try to think of what are some things that I can do to bring in all the different modalities. I want to make sure that they're going to get some listening. I want them to be able to do some reading,
Yes.
a little bit of writing, especially obviously if there's going to be writing on the assessment, and some speaking as well. So I want to make sure that I'm covering all of those things during the course of my unit. And again, going back to that assessment, what am I going to ask them to do, and making sure that we've done that together in class before I ask them to do it. And, we know as teachers who really inform ourselves by the whole process of comprehensible input, language acquisition, we know that output does not create language acquisition. But I do think that having the students create some output in class gives them a lot more confidence. So I do like to kind of spend some time, if that's a skill that they're going to need to be able to do in order to complete whatever task I'm asking of them, I like to do some of that together in class, because then they're not going to feel like they're just suddenly being asked to do this on a test and they've never done it before in class. I just don't think that's fair.
No, I agree with you. I agree. And output is something they want to do. Like they came to
Yeah.
this class to learn to speak Spanish. And
Hmm.
so, I can understand that as a level one, we don't want to force them to make a skit. They don't have enough language to make a skit. Like with
Hmm.
the language that they have, then it becomes, well, they all used Google. But when
Right.
they get up into these intermediate levels and we're having a discussion about the topic, if we've read a resource, they have a resource right there that they can look at to ask questions
Right.
about or to make comments about, or I was surprised by this. So
Yes.
those are great
Yeah.
opportunities to just get the stress level about speaking down.
Yeah. I also would just say if I can give you two pieces of advice, I personally I am
I
always
give them
looking for
three. You can go on.
ways I'm always looking for ways to get my students to connect whatever it is that we're learning about with their own lives. And that can be a stretch sometimes because sometimes we might be learning about something that it's like, oh my gosh, how this is so different from anything that my students have ever experienced. How am I going to connect this? But I love the challenge of finding ways to connect content to their own lives. And I just find when I take the time to have some discussions with my class and get them thinking about their own lives and then showing them how that it can connect to this other content and then having another conversation after they've learned more about that content in which we go back and reconnect to our lives. To me, that is just so powerful when they start to realize that things are not as foreign as they maybe thought that they were. Like, oh, okay, we
Yes.
actually do some of these same things. I just had never thought about it like this, or I never thought that this could be a way of doing something. Like one example that I'll give is I love the song Yo Voy Ganao by Sistema Solar.
Yes.
And in that music video, it's set in Colombia, and the people in the video are fishing. They're fishermen, fisher families, and they're fishing with a giant net. And a lot of my students, because we're in a rural area of Michigan, and Michigan is just full of lakes and rivers, a lot of my students are really avid fishers, but they tend to fish from a kayak or a little aluminum boat. They're not using a
Yeah.
giant net. So I like to start when I'm going to teach them about the fishers in Colombia. I like to start by just chatting with them about fishing. Like, where do you fish? Who do you fish with? How many fish do you usually catch in a day? Do you eat the fish you catch? Who cooks the fish you catch? Do you eat the fish at the beach where you caught the fish, or do you take the fish home? So just conversations like that to start their minds just kind of thinking about how they do things, and then I can introduce this new thing, and then we can make
Yes,
comparisons
that
between the
unit
two.
actually was a lifesaver for me because I had a really tough Spanish 2 group and they loved it. They loved
Yeah.
that they also were fishermen, so
Yeah.
they were really into that unit.
Yeah. And the song is so catchy too, so you don't really mind watching
It
the
is so
video.
catchy and the video is so fun. So, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I really enjoy finding things like that and then figuring out how I can make those personal connections, because to me that's the fun of teaching, is just making those relationships and those personal connections with our students, and we can also connect them to our content. It just makes them more likely to embrace that as well.
Yes, it gives them a why and we know everybody needs a why.
Yeah.
Well, this was
So,
a
well,
great talk. I thank you for talking
yes.
planning with me, and hopefully, we've given you some ideas for going out and planning a unit around a resource that you love. Let us know
Yeah.
if you have questions that we didn't answer.
Yeah, it's always great to talk with you, Carrie. I hope to see you again soon.